All right, so you want to know how to like have a life with fewer arguments, right? Less drama, more peace.
Yeah.
So we're going to dive deep into this podcast called How Can We Truly Live Without Arguments? And it's interesting because it combines spiritual wisdom and like practical advice, which is a pretty cool combination.
Yeah, it really is.
And the thing that hooked me right away was this idea that 90% of our arguments are about stuff that just doesn't even matter in the big picture.
Isn't that crazy?
Like, what if we could just let go of all that?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah, that's the key right there.
Totally. So that this podcast gives us 6 keys to kind of escape this electric atmosphere of constant arguments. And the first one is empathy.
Yeah, empathy, and the Bible verse Ephesians 4.32, it talks about, be kind and understanding to one another and forgive one another as God in Christ has forgiven you. So
Yeah. Okay. So empathy, we hear that word all the time, right?
Right.
Like, what makes this podcast different? How does it actually make empathy something we can use when things get heated?
Well, it gets specific. They use this example of someone snapping at you, which of course happens to all of us. And instead of just like snapping back,
Yeah.
They say, hit pause and say, okay, what if I were in their shoes?
Yeah.
What if they're having a terrible day?
Yeah.
What if something's really going on?
Yeah, I can see how that shift in perspective could really like de-escalate things
Absolutely.
instead of just getting defensive.
Yeah, you're choosing compassion over conflict.
Totally. Yeah. Okay. So empathy is like the foundation.
The foundation.
And then from there, we move to the next key, which is mercy.
Yes, mercy.
Now, this one kind of threw me off at first because I think of mercy as this really like grand, almost unattainable thing, like this huge act of forgiveness. But the podcast presents it in a way that's actually pretty doable.
Well, they root it in Psalm 86.15, which describes God as, full of tenderness and gracious to us and slow to anger and rich in love and faithfulness.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the idea is that if God, who's perfect, can extend mercy to us when we mess up, why shouldn't we try to do the same for others?
I get it.
Yeah.
So it's less about this dramatic gesture and more about just making a choice to forgive instead of punish,
Right.
even when the other person is wrong.
Exactly, even when they're guilty.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, the podcast even makes this interesting connection between choosing mercy and aligning ourselves with God's perspective. They talk about how the devil is called the accuser of the brethren.
Right. Right.
So it's like when we choose mercy, we're not feeding into that negativity.
Yeah.
We're choosing something higher.
Wow. Yeah. That's pretty profound. Okay. So we've got empathy and mercy.
Yes.
2 powerful forces working together to kind of diffuse those arguments.
Absolutely.
But let's be real, even when we forgive and we understand where the other person's coming from, sometimes that hurt still lingers.
Yes.
How do we move past that and truly let go?
Right.
And that's where this whole forgiveness and forgetting thing comes in, right?
Exactly. And, Isaiah 43.25 says, I will forgive your transgressions and will not remember your sins.
Now, when I first read that, I thought, wait a minute, am I supposed to have amnesia?
Right. Like, how is that even possible?
Yeah, like forget all the bad stuff.
Right. But the podcast clarifies that, forgetting doesn't mean literally wiping the memory from our minds.
Okay.
It's more about releasing the emotional pain that's attached to it.
Okay.
So you might still remember what happened,
Yeah.
but it no longer has the power to trigger you or, bring up those feelings of hurt and resentment.
That makes a lot more sense.
Yeah.
So it's not about pretending it never happened.
Right.
It's about taking the sting out of it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this connects with Hebrews 12.15, which talks about the danger of bitterness.
Okay.
Bitterness is like this poisonous root that can grow and spread.
Ooh, I like that imagery.
Yeah, and it can infect our whole being.
Yeah, it's like we're carrying around all this baggage
Right.
that weighs us down and keeps us from really experiencing freedom and joy.
Absolutely. And so the podcast really challenges us to ask ourselves, is holding on to this resentment really worth it?
Yeah.
What am I gaining by clinging to this pain?
Okay. I'm feeling challenged here. So empathy, mercy, forgiveness, that creates this foundation of peace.
A strong foundation.
But I'm guessing it takes more than just good intentions to really break free from arguing all the time.
Of course.
So what's the next step in this journey toward living a more harmonious life?
Well, you know how we were talking about all those little arguments?
Yeah, the
1%, they're the ones that make up like most of our conflicts.
Right.
The next key is all about learning how to de-dramatize those everyday annoyances that tend to trigger us.
Okay, less drama. I'm all for it.
Yeah.
But what does that actually look like? Can you give me an example?
Okay, so think about it. Someone speaks to you in a tone you don't like. Someone's late. You don't get invited to something.
Oh, yeah.
These are the kinds of things that can easily escalate into these big arguments.
Yeah, my brain goes to the worst case scenario immediately, and I'm like making up this whole story about how this person doesn't respect me.
Right.
Or they don't care about my feelings.
Yeah.
How do I stop myself from like spiraling?
That's where you ask yourself that question. Is it worth it?
Mm-hmm.
The podcast challenges us to consider, is this truly worth the emotional energy of an argument? Are we giving this situation more importance than it deserves?
It's not about ignoring our feelings.
Right.
It's about choosing our battles.
Exactly.
Will this matter a year from now?
Right, exactly.
5 years from now?
Exactly. And, sometimes just pausing and asking yourself that question is enough to kind of cool things down
Yeah.
and prevent things from escalating.
Totally. So being empathetic, merciful, forgiving, and putting things in perspective,
Yes.
that's a lot.
It is.
What's
Yeah.
the next key to unlocking a more peaceful life?
This one might be my favorite, remembering the good.
I love this one. It's so easy to get caught up in the negative,
Right.
but when you intentionally focus on the positive,
Right.
it really does shift your whole perspective.
It does.
It's like choosing to see the light instead of getting stuck in the darkness.
Yes. And they actually root this principle in Proverbs 27.6, which says, "The wounds of a friend can be trusted, but an enemy multiplies kisses." And what I think is so powerful about that verse is that it acknowledges that even the people we love
Yeah.
will hurt us sometimes.
Yeah, they're not perfect.
They're not perfect,
Yeah.
right? But that doesn't negate all the good they've brought into our lives.
It's like we have this tendency to just focus on the flaws.
Right.
But what if we flipped the script and made a conscious effort to remember the blessings?
Exactly.
The good times, the acts of kindness,
Yes.
the moments that made us smile.
Yes, the podcast encourages us to make a list of all the reasons we value that person
Yeah.
in our lives.
I love that it's like taking a step back and saying, okay, this person messed up and I'm hurt, but they've also been there for me in countless ways and I'm grateful for them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And this practice can be especially helpful when you're feeling tempted to just throw away a relationship
Right.
over a single mistake.
Yeah.
Before you make that decision, take some time to remember the good.
Yeah.
It might just save the relationship.
Okay, this is making me think about some relationships in my own life, but we'll save that for another time.
Yeah.
We've got one more key to explore. What is it?
This one might be the most important of all. It's surprisingly simple. Is it worth it?
Ooh, that's a powerful question.
Yeah.
What does the podcast have to say about this?
Well, they use Proverbs 17.14 as a springboard for this discussion, which says, starting a quarrel is like breaching a dam. Stop it before it bursts.
Ooh, I love that image.
So it's about recognizing that once we unleash those floodgates of anger and resentment, it can be really hard to contain the damage.
Yeah. I know for me, the aftermath of an argument is often way worse than whatever started it in the first place.
It's so true. And, the podcast also points out that a lot of our arguments stem from this place of pride. We're so focused on proving you're right
Yeah.
that we lose sight of what really matters, the relationship itself.
Yeah. I think we've all been there. It's like our ego takes over.
Right.
And we're willing to sacrifice peace and harmony just to win the argument.
Right. Just to win.
But what if we could just let go of that need to be right and choose connection instead?
That's what we're going to explore in part 2 of our deep dive.
Okay, I'm ready.
We'll unpack how to actually apply these 6 keys in those everyday situations that tend to trigger us.
This has been so insightful.
I'm glad.
I'm already starting to see how these principles could really transform my relationships, but I'm definitely hungry for more practical tips and strategies.
I hear you. Be sure to join us for part 2, where we'll delve even deeper into the nuts and bolts of living a more peaceful and harmonious life.
Until then, remember, peace starts with you.
Absolutely. Welcome back to our deep dive into a life with less arguing. If you're just tuning in, you might want to catch part 1, where we laid out these 6 keys from this podcast.
Yeah, we talked about empathy, mercy, forgiveness, with that emphasis on truly letting go.
Yes.
Putting things in perspective, remembering the good, and that question, is it worth it?
Yeah, that's a big one.
So now we're going to take those principles and actually see how they play out in real life.
Exactly. How do we use them?
Yeah, like, let's say I'm in the middle of an argument and things are starting to get heated. What's my first move?
Well, that's where empathy comes in. Remember, it's all about trying to see things from the other person's perspective. So instead of reacting right away, take a breath and ask yourself, what might be going on with this person?
So instead of just focusing on their words or their tone.
Yeah. which can be pretty grating sometimes.
Oh, yeah, for sure. We're trying to understand the emotions underneath.
Exactly, and this can be tough, especially if you're feeling hurt or angry yourself.
Yeah.
But remember, everyone's fighting their own battles, and sometimes that spills over into our interactions with others.
Yeah, I've definitely been on both sides of that.
Right?
Sometimes you're the one with the short fuse, and sometimes you're on the receiving end.
Exactly.
Okay, so we're practicing empathy, but what if the other person is just wrong? Like objectively wrong? Do I still have to extend mercy?
That's a great question, and that's where this idea of mercy gets really interesting. Think back to that description of God in Psalms 86.5 Akan. Slow to anger, rich in love and faithfulness.
Yeah.
And the podcast makes this point, that we all make mistakes.
Yeah.
And offering mercy is a powerful way to break that cycle of blame and resentment.
It's funny because when I think about extending mercy to someone who's wronged me, part of me feels like I'm letting them off the hook.
I get that.
Like, shouldn't there be some kind of consequence?
Yeah.
But I guess what you're saying is that holding on to that anger is actually more punishing for me than it is for them. Yeah.
It is. It really is. And remember, offering mercy doesn't mean condoning their behavior.
Right.
It's about choosing to release the anger and bitterness that's weighing you down. The podcast actually describes forgiveness as a gift you give yourself, which I thought was so insightful.
Yeah.
It's not about them. It's about you choosing freedom.
I like that. Okay, so I've practiced empathy and mercy, but the hurt's still there.
Okay.
How do I move past that and truly let go?
That's the thing about forgetting. It's not about erasing the memory.
Right.
The podcast makes that really clear.
Yeah.
It's more about stripping that memory of its emotional power.
Okay. Help me understand that.
Okay. So think of it this way. You can probably recall a time when you fell off your bike as a kid.
Right.
You remember it happened.
Yeah.
But it probably doesn't bring up those same intense feelings of pain and fear that it did in the moment.
Yeah, that's a great analogy. So we're acknowledging the event happened, but we're not letting it control our emotions anymore.
Exactly. The memory's there, but the sting is gone.
Oh.
Now, this takes time and effort. It might involve journaling prayer, maybe talking to a therapist.
Yeah.
The key is to actively work toward releasing that pain and replacing it with peace and understanding.
So it's not passive. I have to actually choose to let go.
You have to choose. And, the podcast makes this interesting connection between holding on to negative emotions and that idea of the devil being the accuser of the brethren.
Right.
It's like when we refuse to let go, we're actually playing right into his hands.
That's a new way of looking at it. It's like holding on to it gives it power, and letting go takes that power away.
Exactly.
Okay, so empathy, mercy, forgiveness. We're making progress.
We are.
What's the next step?
This is where putting things in perspective becomes super important. Remember that stat we talked about? 90% of our arguments are about stuff that just doesn't matter in the long run.
Yeah, but sometimes it feels like everything's a big deal when you're in the heat of the moment.
It does.
My pulse is racing, my thoughts are jumbled, and suddenly that dirty dish in the sink feels like a personal attack.
It does.
How do I gain perspective when my emotions are running high?
One thing they recommend in the podcast is ask yourself, will this matter a year from now, 5 years from now?
It's funny you say that. I actually use a similar technique in my own life, but it's more about decision-making when I'm feeling stressed about a choice I have to make. I ask myself, will this even matter a month from now, a year from now? And 9 times out of 10, the answer is no.
That's exactly the idea. It's about zooming out and seeing the situation from a wider lens. And, the podcast also reminds us that none of us are perfect.
True.
We all make mistakes. We have bad days. And sometimes we just say or do things we regret.
Yeah.
Giving each other a little grace can go a long way.
Totally.
And preventing those insignificant things from turning into blowouts.
Okay, I'm loving this. So we're being empathetic, merciful, forgiving, putting things in perspective. I'm feeling calmer already.
Good.
What's next?
This one might be my favorite, remembering the good.
Oh, yes. We touched on this earlier, but I'm eager to dive a little deeper. It's so easy to get caught up in the negative, especially when you're feeling hurt or betrayed. But when you intentionally focus on the positive, it really does shift your whole perspective.
It does. It's like consciously choosing to see the light instead of getting stuck in the darkness.
Exactly. And this principle has roots in Proverbs 27.6, which says, "The wounds of a friend can be trusted, but an enemy multiplies kisses."
And you know what I think is so powerful about that verse is that it acknowledges that even the people we love are going to hurt us sometimes.
Yeah, it's inevitable.
It's inevitable, but that doesn't negate all the good they've brought into our lives.
I think this is where a lot of people get tripped up.
I think so too.
They experience a hurt or a betrayal, and suddenly it's like their whole perception of that person changes.
Yeah.
All the good times, the shared memories, the acts of kindness, it all gets overshadowed by this one negative experience.
Right.
But that's not a balanced perspective, is it?
Not at all. The podcast encourages us to take an inventory of all the ways this person has blessed us, all the reasons we value their presence in our lives. It's about shifting our focus from the flaws to the blessings.
I'm curious, have you ever used this technique in your own life?
I actually have. A few years ago, I had a falling out with a close friend.
Oh.
It was messy. There were hurt feelings on both sides.
Yeah.
And we didn't speak for a long time, but eventually I decided I didn't want to lose her friendship
Yeah.
over this one incident. So I started making an effort to remember all the good times we had shared, all the ways she had supported me over the years. And it really helped soften my heart.
Wow, that's a really powerful example. Did you guys end up reconciling?
We did, and it was actually pretty amazing. We both apologized, acknowledged our part in the conflict, and agreed to move forward with a clean slate.
Wow.
And honestly, our friendship is stronger than ever now.
I love that it's like proof that forgiveness and reconciliation are possible,
They are.
even when things seem hopeless.
They are.
Okay, so we've covered 5 of the 6 keys. And I'm really starting to see how these principles work together to create more peaceful existence.
A more peaceful life.
What's the final piece of the puzzle?
This one might be the most important of all, and it's surprisingly simple. Is it worth it?
Ooh, that's a good one. I have a feeling this is going to resonate with a lot of our listeners. It's such a powerful question, and it can apply to so many different areas of life.
It can. And, the podcast uses Proverbs 17.1 as a jumping off point for this discussion, which says, starting a quarrel is like breaching a dam, stop it before it bursts.
I love that analogy. It's like once those floodgates of anger and resentment open, it can be almost impossible to stop the flow.
It's true. And, it's not about suppressing our emotions or pretending everything's fine when it's not.
Right.
It's about recognizing that engaging in an all-out argument can cause serious damage.
Yeah.
It can hurt feelings, it can lead to regret.
Totally.
And it can even jeopardize the relationship.
I think a lot of us have experienced this firsthand. You get caught up in the heat of the moment, you say things you don't mean, and then you're left feeling worse than you did before the argument even started.
It's so true. And the podcast emphasizes that a lot of our arguments stem from pride. We're so focused on proving we're right that we lose sight of what really matters, the relationship itself.
I think we've all been there.
We have.
It's like our ego takes over and we're willing to sacrifice peace and harmony just to win the argument.
Just to win. And so, before you engage in that battle, ask yourself, is winning this argument really worth jeopardizing this relationship?
That's such a good point. And sometimes just pausing for a moment and asking yourself, is it worth it? Is enough to diffuse the situation and prevent things from escalating.
It's like giving yourself that space to respond thoughtfully rather than just react impulsively.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it's important to recognize that choosing peace doesn't mean we'll never experience conflict.
Of course not.
The disagreements are a natural part of life, especially when we're interacting with people who have different perspectives and opinions, and that's okay.
It's healthy even.
It is.
And, this brings up another really important point, that the podcast touches on the importance of communication.
Okay, communication, that's a big one.
It is.
We all know it's important.
We do.
But what does effective communication actually look like when you're trying to resolve a conflict?
Well, first and foremost, it involves active listening.
So more than just hearing the words, it's about actually understanding what the other person is saying.
Exactly.
Both their words and their feelings.
Exactly. It's about putting aside your own thoughts and judgments and truly trying to see things from their perspective.
Okay, but I think a lot of people, myself included, struggle with that, especially when you're feeling defensive or triggered. It's like you're so focused on formulating your own response that you're not really listening to what the other person is saying.
I've been there too. And the podcast actually reminds us that misunderstandings are at the root of many conflicts. By taking the time to truly listen to each other, we can clear up those misunderstandings and prevent things from escalating.
That's a really good point. It's like sometimes just clarifying what we heard and making sure we understand each other's perspective can go a long way in resolving the conflict.
It can.
Okay, so we're practicing active listening, but what about expressing our own thoughts and feelings?
Yes.
How do we do that assertively without resorting to attacks or blame?
Right.
Because I know I can be guilty of that.
I think we all can.
Yeah.
But the podcast offers a really helpful tool for this I statements.
Okay.
Instead of saying, you always do this,
Right.
or you never listen to me, which can feel accusatory.
Yeah.
And put the other person on the defensive, try phrasing it like this: I feel hurt when this happens, or I need you to listen to me when I'm talking about something important.
Okay. Yeah, I see the difference. It's about owning your own emotions and expressing your needs clearly without attacking the other person.
Exactly.
It's like shifting the focus from blame to understanding.
Exactly. And, the podcast also emphasizes choosing the right time and place to have these conversations.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
It's probably not the best idea to try to hash things out when you're both stressed, tired, or hungry.
Oh, definitely not hanger is a real thing.
Hanger is real.
It's like picking the right battleground for your conversation.
Yes, if you're not in the right headspace or environment, it's probably going to end badly.
Right.
And it's also important to create a safe and respectful environment where both parties feel comfortable expressing themselves honestly, without fear of judgment or retaliation.
Yeah, if someone doesn't feel safe, they're not going to open up.
They're not.
This is so helpful. Okay, so we've talked about communication, but what about anger?
Ooh, anger.
It's such a powerful emotion that can really hijack a conversation.
It can. It's like a wildfire.
Yeah, if it's not managed effectively.
Exactly. And this is actually an area where the podcast offers some really practical advice. They talk about the importance of recognizing your anger triggers.
Okay, that makes sense. If
Yeah.
you know what tends to set you off, you can be more prepared to handle it. But how do you actually do that?
It's about paying attention to the situations, people, or thoughts that tend to make you angry.
Okay.
Maybe it's being interrupted, feeling disrespected, or even just being tired and hungry.
Yeah.
Once you're aware of your triggers, you can start to develop strategies for managing them.
Okay, I'm with you so far, but let's get specific. Say I know that being interrupted really sets me off.
Okay.
What can I do to prevent that from turning into a full-blown anger outburst?
The podcast recommends a few different strategies. One is to communicate your needs up front. You could say something like, hey, I really need to finish my thought before you jump in, or it's important to me that I feel heard.
That's a great tip. It's like setting those boundaries beforehand so the other person knows how to interact with you in a way that respects your needs.
Exactly. And the podcast also suggests taking timeouts when needed.
Okay.
If you feel yourself getting overwhelmed with anger, it's perfectly okay to step away from the situation for a few minutes to calm down.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's like recognizing that you're not in a good place to have a productive conversation, and you need a little space to regulate your emotions
Exactly.
before you can engage constructively.
Yes.
What are some things you can do during that timeout to calm yourself down?
Well, the podcast recommends things like deep breathing exercises, counting to 10, or even taking a walk to clear your head.
You know, I actually find it helpful to have a go-to mantra or affirmation that I can repeat to myself when I'm feeling triggered. It's like a little anchor that helps ground me and brings me back to a place of peace.
Oh, I love that. What's your go-to mantra?
It's actually really simple. Peace begins with me.
Oh, that's good.
It's a reminder that I have the power to choose peace,
Yes.
even when things are chaotic around me.
I love that it's a powerful reminder that we're not victims of our circumstances. We always have a choice.
We do. Okay, so we've talked about managing anger.
We have.
But what about those times when we've really messed up and hurt someone we care about? How do we repair that damage and rebuild trust?
That's a good question, and that's where sincere apologies come in.
Okay, we all know we're supposed to apologize when we've hurt someone, but what does a sincere apology actually look like?
Right.
Because sometimes it feels like just saying, I'm sorry, isn't enough.
You're right. A truly sincere apology goes beyond just those two words. It involves acknowledging the harm you've caused, taking responsibility for your actions, and expressing genuine remorse for the pain you've inflicted.
So it's not just about saying the words, it's about actually demonstrating that you understand the impact of your behavior and that you genuinely regret hurting the other person.
Exactly. And, the podcast also emphasizes the importance of making amends when possible.
Okay.
Words are important, but actions often speak even louder.
So what does that look like in practice? What are some ways you can make amends?
It could involve, offering a heartfelt apology, doing something kind for the person you've hurt, or making a commitment to change your behavior in the future. It's about taking concrete steps to repair the damage you've caused.
I love that it's like showing the other person that you're not just sorry for what you did, but that you're committed to making things right.
Exactly. And, the podcast also reminds us that forgiveness is a process.
Yeah,
And it often takes time.
For sure.
We can't expect someone to just magically forgive us overnight, especially if we've hurt them deeply.
That's a really important point. It's like we have to respect their process and give them the space and time they need to heal.
You got it. And, sometimes the best we can do is offer a sincere apology, respect their need for space, and continue to demonstrate through our actions that we're committed to change.
This is all so helpful. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground in this part of our deep dive. We've talked about empathy, mercy, forgiveness, putting things in perspective, remembering the good, asking ourselves, is it worth it? Communication, managing anger, and sincere apologies. Like we've created this whole toolbox of strategies for navigating conflict more effectively.
We have a whole toolbox.
And building healthier, more fulfilling relationships.
Yes. And, it's not about mastering all of these techniques overnight.
Right.
It's about choosing one or two that resonate with you and starting to put them into practice in your everyday life.
Yeah.
Even small changes can make a big difference over time.
I love that it's not about perfection, it's about progress.
It is.
Okay, so we've laid the groundwork and explored a bunch of practical strategies for putting these principles into action. What's next on our journey toward peace?
Well, in part 3, we're going to shift gears a bit and explore what happens when we apply these principles not just to our individual interactions, but to our lives as a whole. Because here's the thing, it's not just about reducing arguments, it's about creating a ripple effect of peace that touches every aspect of our existence.
Ooh, I'm intrigued. I have a feeling part 3 is going to be really inspiring.
I think so too. Be sure to join us for part 3, where we'll delve even deeper into the transformative power of living a more peaceful life.
Until then, remember, peace starts with you. All right, so we're back. We're wrapping up our deep dive into a life with less arguing.
Yeah, fewer blow-ups, more peace.
Exactly. And if you're just tuning in, you'll want to catch parts 1 and 2, where we explore these 6 powerful principles for transforming conflict based on this podcast. How can we truly live without arguments?
Yeah, it's been a good conversation.
It has. So we talked about empathy, mercy, forgiveness, perspective, remembering the good, and that big question, is it worth it?
Right. So many good tools.
So many good tools. And today we're kind of taking a step back and thinking about the ripple effects of all this.
Okay, the big picture.
Yeah, because it's not just about reducing the number of arguments we have.
Right.
It's about the kind of life that unfolds when we embrace peace as just a way of being.
A way of life.
Yeah. And one thing that really struck me about this podcast is how it emphasizes the spiritual dimension of peace. It's not just the absence of conflict, but it's this deep sense of inner harmony that flows from our connection to something bigger than ourselves.
I love that it's peace that comes from within.
Yeah, exactly. So it's when we align ourselves with these principles of empathy, mercy, and forgiveness, we're tapping into something deeper.
We are.
Something that goes beyond just our individual
A
actions.
spiritual reality.
Yeah, and the podcast points to this verse, Ephesians 4.3132, which says, "Get rid of all bitterness, rage and anger, brawling and slander, along with every form of malice. Be kind and compassionate to one another, forgiving each other, just as in Christ God forgave you."
Wow, that's powerful.
It's we're being called to embody a whole different way of being in the world.
Yeah, one that's rooted in love, compassion.
Exactly. And I think this is where that concept of remembering the good becomes so important.
Okay.
Because when we focus on the positive aspects of our relationships and our lives, it cultivates this spirit of gratitude and appreciation that has the power to transform everything.
I love it. It's training our minds to see the good.
Yeah, to focus on the blessings even when things are tough.
Even in the midst of challenges.
Yeah, and it creates this ripple effect of positivity.
It does.
That extends outward.
It's contagious.
Totally. I've been thinking a lot about choice throughout this whole deep dive. It seems like every principle we've discussed comes down to making a conscious choice. To respond with empathy instead of anger, to offer mercy instead of judgment, to focus on the good instead of dwelling on the negative.
Right, and that's empowering.
It is. It's realizing we have more control over our experience than we think.
We do. We have more power than we realize.
Totally. And this podcast also highlights the importance of managing anger wisely.
Oh, anger, that's a big one.
It is, because when we learn to control our anger, it creates space for peace and understanding.
Yeah, and we talked about some practical strategies for doing that.
Right.
Like taking time outs, practicing deep breathing, even just repeating affirmations to shift our mindset.
Yeah, it's like building up our emotional resilience so we can handle those tough moments with more grace.
Absolutely. And, a lot of people think managing anger means suppressing their emotions.
Right. Or pretending everything's okay when it's not.
Exactly. But it's really about learning to express our anger in a healthy way.
So it doesn't control us or damage our relationships.
Yes. And I've noticed in my own life that when I can manage my anger effectively, it actually helps me connect with people better.
Oh, interesting. Tell me more about that.
Well, when I'm not letting my anger control me,
Yeah.
I can actually hear what the other person is saying.
Yeah,
I can understand their perspective, and that opens the door to deeper connection.
that makes sense. It's like you're not letting those intense emotions get in the way of understanding.
Right, and the source material makes this connection between anger and pride.
Interesting.
It's like when we're consumed with our own ego,
Yeah,
when we're so focused on being right,
right.
we get defensive and we lash out.
Totally.
But when we approach things with humility and a willingness to listen, it creates a whole different energy.
I love that, I've definitely been in situations where my pride has prevented me from resolving a conflict peacefully.
I think we all have.
Yeah, and it's like letting go of that need to be right,
Mhm.
choosing peace over pride. That's what opens up compassion.
That's the key.
Okay, so we've talked about the spiritual dimension of peace, the power of gratitude, the importance of managing anger wisely. What else does this podcast highlight as we embrace this life with fewer arguments?
You know, choosing peace doesn't mean we'll never experience conflict.
Right.
Disagreements are just part of life,
Yeah.
especially with people who have different views and opinions, and that's okay.
Yeah, I think sometimes people get this idea that if they're doing everything right, if they're practicing these principles, their lives should be perfect.
Right. No conflict.
Yeah, like conflict-free, but that's just not realistic.
It's not. And it's actually more helpful to see conflict as a chance to grow and understand each other better.
I like that reframe.
Yeah, because when we approach disagreements with curiosity and a willingness to learn it, can actually make our relationship stronger.
Yeah, it's like we're shifting from seeing conflict as something to avoid
Right?
to seeing it as a potential catalyst for positive change.
Exactly. And, the principles we've been talking about provide a framework for doing just that. When we come to the table with empathy, mercy, and understanding,
Yeah.
it opens up space for respectful dialogue and creative problem solving.
I love that it's like we're turning these potentially explosive situations into opportunities for connection.
We are. It's like alchemy,
It is peace alchemy.
turning conflict into something beautiful.
Exactly. And this brings up another point. Choosing peace is an ongoing journey.
Yes, it's not a destination.
It's something we have to cultivate every single day.
Every day, even in those small moments.
It's like any other skill we want to develop. It takes consistency and dedication.
It does.
Okay.
And, the podcast uses this analogy of a garden
Oh, I love garden analogies.
to describe this process.
Yeah.
It's like we have to tend to the garden of our hearts, planting seeds of peace, watering them with compassion, and pulling out the weeds of anger and resentment.
I love that image. It really highlights how important it is to be intentional.
Right.
Peace doesn't just happen. We have to cultivate it. We have to nurture it.
We do. We have to make a choice.
And, as we cultivate peace in our own lives, it creates this ripple effect
That does.
that touches everyone around us.
It's like we become these beacons of peace, radiating harmony and understanding.
Wow, that's beautiful. It reminds me of that Gandhi quote, "Be the change you wish to see in the world."
Yes.
It all starts with us cultivating peace within ourselves,
And then letting it flow outward.
inspiring others to do the same.
I love that. And, I think that's the big takeaway from this deep dive.
Yeah, what is it?
It's not just about living with fewer arguments. It's about becoming peacemakers, contributing to a more harmonious and compassionate world, one interaction at a time.
That's such a beautiful vision, and I truly believe it's possible.
I do too.
Even with all the chaos and conflict we see in the world today.
It starts with us
It does. It starts with each of us making a choice to embrace peace.
as a way of life.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into living a more peaceful and harmonious life.
It's been a pleasure.
We hope you've gained some valuable insights and some practical tools that you can start using today.
Absolutely.
Until next time, keep cultivating that peace.
Peace out.